how is it that we're going to define in many ways what is the good? We brought up kind of youth with road dilemma stuff. We brought up bases for defining what good would be. I had advanced this as a identity relationship, that which is perfectly good is the same as that which is perfectly loving, that there are no properties of one or the other that are not the same. Also advanced maybe a more contentious and less precise proposition that said something like, if you that any use of the word good that doesn't include a moral component to it is a misuse of the word. Now that may be a little bit extreme, I'll admit that, but that's really, if anything, a complaint on my part to say there should not be a single word for evaluating a thing when that thing has a moral component to it. So this is a good, maybe within some overreach, if anything, in our kind of back and forth. Maybe there are good clothes, maybe there aren't good clothes. So maybe if we say there's a class of clothing that doesn't have any kind of moral implications whatsoever, whatever that class of clothing is, then the difference between the colors may simply be down to aesthetic differences or to preference. In which case, all right, I'm happy to say, then say why use the word good. But I was basically complaining that when someone says this is a good book, or someone says he's a good leader, that unless you can call out, if you're going to call Hitler a good leader, you probably ought to at least explain why you're using a term that also carries with it typically moral weight. So, at any rate, in the middle of all that, we ran out of time. So let's get back into as much of that as you want. And I think I promised you the first question. So why don't you kick us off with the first question or observation, as you wish.
Yeah, not necessarily that I disagree with the first one up there, but I disagree with the crossing out of the second one there.
Very good. Okay.
Refer to it like as well-being.
Yes.
So anything that supports the well-being of humanity is good.
Okay, so good equals well-being. And what do you mean when you say well-being?
As in, so we were kind of talking about the psychos and stuff, how it's good for their well-being to kill people, but that's against someone else's well-being, so therefore that's not a good action.
Okay, very good. So let me see if I understand this properly. This also comes from, do you source your use of the term well-being in Sam Harris's use of the term well-being?
I don't know, I haven't heard Sam Harris.
Okay, well then let's at least say something like this. If what you're saying is right, so here you're talking about well-being as a facet of reality that is not down to the individual level. That is to say, your well-being and my well-being are not purely subjective. There's some objective measure of well-being. Otherwise, the psycho's well-being and the non-psychotic person's well-being are on parity. And so you're at okay, I have better well-being by killing people if I'm a psycho. I have better well-being by not being killed and living in a society where you don't have psychos running around killing people. So those aren't equal. We have to say, nope, there's an actual standard that we're using for well-being. Okay, if I understand you rightly then, let's say here's a graph with well-being on the y-axis, and over here on the x-axis, each point or interval or whatever is an individual. So person A, person B, person C, person D. And so you can measure their well-being, and let's say on a scale of 1 to, we'll just do 1 to 10 here for fun. And this person's well-being is at a 5, and this person's is at a, 7 or so. This person's at a 6.5. This person's having a really bad time. This person's darn near ecstatic. And so basically you can build, this is what Sam Harris was calling a moral landscape that has, these different people occupying persons, and I think he uses the term conscious or sentient beings with the implication of consciousness as somehow the thing that you're shooting for, and you can't really have well-being if you're not conscious of it or something like that. Okay, and so one of the arguments, the problem with Sam's view was, here's a peak of well-being. Here's somebody at a 10. And so he originally said well-being is identical with goodness. Well-being is identical with goodness, and with the exception of, and he said, well, a possible problem for this view is that psychopaths can report being at a 10 level well-being, or think genuinely believe they're at a 10 level well-being, so they're occupying this height of well-being. But Sam would turn around and say, but psychopaths killing people is bad. So he says, if he says that a person at the peak of well-being, which he has said this, well-being equals good. Now here's one example of well-being equals not good. Okay, so here's a person at the peak.
I think you're talking about.
I know, I'm not talking about his argument, I'm talking about Sam's argument. And then I'm going to map it to his argument and ask the question of if this is what you mean. So if well-being is equal to not good, this was considered the problem with Sam Harris's argument, is that he makes an identity claim that good is equal to well-being, but then he admits that there are people who occupy the peaks of well-being, i.e. the maximum value of well-being for an individual, who are not good. So he's got a definitional problem there. Now tell me how your view of well-being differs from Sam's view of well-being. Unless what you're saying is the individual points don't count. So I'm not saying that the peaks of well-being, individual peaks of well-being are mattered. What actually matters is the area under the curve. Whatever maximizes the area under the curve is equal to well-being. Is that what you're saying? Closer to what you're saying?
I mean, I guess I agree with the area under the curve represents the well-being. So, I mean, even though that person's at a 10, it doesn't make it okay to take away someone who's at a 3, their well-being.
Okay. Now, we'll do a non-human example or a human and something else example, and then we'll go back to the example you just used. Let's pretend for a second, though, that there is an alien race out there, not implausible. A lot of people think that may be the case. And it turns out that their well-being, these aliens are capable of being 10 times happier than we are on a bad day. A bad day for an alien, they're 10 times better than we are. And they live on resources like every barrel of oil that we use, that we can live a year on or whatever else, they can live 1,000 years on. And their lifetimes are 10,000 years long. So if such an alien race exists and they're going to make their way to Earth eventually, here's kind of a problem. If the aliens show up, then using the same resources we do, their well-being curve kind of looks like this. Now you're trying to maximize the area under the curve. But we're sitting here burning through resources that they could use. So if it was the case that we knew these aliens were going to show up, what is our moral duty? If it's our moral duty, which it's our moral duty to do what is good, what is our moral duty if we know aliens are going to show up that are capable of having so much more well-being, of maximizing this area under the curve? What should we do?
Like that humanity.
We have a moral duty to mass suicide and genocide.
So that's only if you're playing the finite game, though. But if you're going forever,
Sure, but our universe doesn't look like that, does it? Our universe, it looks like it's expanding to heat death. So we're not playing a finite game, an infinite game. We're playing a finite game. At least in our case, we're playing a finite game.
And you don't
So
know what's
why
in
are
front of
we
you.
killing ourselves?
Because we're burning up resources these aliens are going to run out of resources. They show up, they're going to be 10,000 times happier than we are. So we're burning through stuff that would make them, that's denying them the future capacity to
I'm
be
sorry,
happy.
they came here without resources?
They-
What kind of well-being is that?
Well, they used all up they used all their well-being already. So if in this case you would say, well, okay, now we have to do it on some temporal scale, then you're arguing for something that's not absolute, that is in some way relative.
Yeah, because I still think it would be wrong for everyone to commit mass suicide because that's taking away everyone else's well-being.
It is, but it's maximizing the area under the curve, which is what you said you were looking to maximize.
I don't necessarily agree with that. I'm
Okay.
not sure like it's maximize, the goal is to maximize it, the goal is to maintain whatever well-being there is and not take away from it.
Okay, why is that the case? Why would the goal not being increasing well-being? If well-being equals good, which is what you said, well-being equals good, then why do you not want to maximize the good?
I do want to maximize good if it doesn't take away from others' well-being.
But why the if?
Because I don't think it's good to take away others' well-being.
But why is it not good? If well-being is what is good, then why is taking away others' well-being in order to increase total well-being not good?
Because well-being is good, so if you take away others' well-being, that's not good.
Well, let's say this. Water is good. Let's just make that statement. Water is good. And he's got some water. This probably isn't a very good analogy. I think of a better one. I think the idea, let's say that making money is good. All right, the more money that we make, the better people are gonna be. So everybody's got $1 in here, but you realize that this couple right here can turn around and take $1 and turn it into 10, and that they're then going to give it back. So if making money is good, period, then and they can make 10 times as much as anybody else here, it's morally obligatory to take this everybody else's money, give it to them, let them multiply it, and then pass it back out. So you've taken away for some period of time the good, the money from these people, in order to give them back greater good. That's if you don't have a caveat in there. So if what you're going to say, though, is something like this: well-being equals good unless you have to take it away.
So is that a zero-sum game?
Unless you have to take it away. But my question is, here's a qualifier.
You're like taking it away from people who are bad.
So if it's, sorry, go ahead.
So I was going to say, I'm going to come back to what I said last week. I think you're playing an absolutes game. And that, what I mean by that is, yes, there are objective moral values and duties, but that doesn't equate necessarily to good. In that, if you necessarily are equating what he said, well-being equals good, which equals moral values and duties, then you're into this problem. But I don't think that's necessary. And I don't think it's biblically necessary.
What we're trying to do is establish a necessary relation. We're trying to establish a definitional relationship.
Yeah.
Not a necessary one, but one that's
Like you
definitional.
said, good, loving encompasses all good, and good encompasses all of loving.
Yes.
And then you kind of implied that good is moral excellency or contains values and duties objectively.
Yes.
But I'm saying that's not correct. I think there are aspects, there is a moral good which does equate to moral excellency. But that doesn't equate to all of what good is. And just Genesis 1:3, right?
Sure, but the purpose we're trying to do, let me clarify a couple of things. One, I'm not claiming there's a necessary relationship, that perfectly good necessarily equals perfectly loving.
No, you said that the first thing you said was
No, what I said was
everything that is included in loving is entirely included in good.
yeah, but I didn't say that. I didn't say
which
that was
equates them.
no. I didn't say that was necessarily the case.
All right.
What I said is the identity relationship is a necessary relationship. But if it's the case that that which is perfectly good has no properties that differ at all from that which is perfectly loving, then by Leibniz's law they would be identical. And an identity relationship is a necessary relationship. But I'm not saying because something is perfectly loving, necessarily it's perfectly good, unless we understand that relationship to be the case. So I'm not claiming that it's obvious that that's necessarily the case. I'm saying I'm making an identity relationship, and the reason that I'm claiming they're identical is that I'm claiming there are no properties that differ between the two.
Right. So that's your proposition.
Yes.
And I disagree with your proposition.
Then, but it's trivially easy to do so. All you have to do is show one property that is a property of that which is perfectly good, that is not a property of that which is perfectly loving.
Sure, you almost did it yourself. You backed out of it, but you said, "Let's say water is good."
Okay. Yeah, but I was making a
Right. Well, let's
point
back
of,
into Genesis 1:3. When God creates, He separates the land from the water, and He looks at it and He says, "This is good."
Yep.
That's amoral, and not that it's bad. It just doesn't have a moral component to it.
Well,
it's water and land.
It depends on what God meant when He said this is perfectly good. If what He said is, I have in my mind terrestrial land-dwelling mammals to put my image on, then it's good to make terrestrial land for them to live on. What He means is, for my purpose of allowing these people to live in a place, this is a good thing. This is something that they're going to have in order for that to be the case. In order for me to love them, or think about your own kids. You're trying to make a house for your kids. Let's say that's a good thing, that you think that's a loving thing to do for your kids, is to help build a house for them. And you have no land on which to do it. If you could do the Netherlands thing and reclaim some land, now that would be good.
So I understand what you're saying.
Because
but
it's
that's
loving.
not what I believe the text says. And I think there are multiple other state places in biblically, that have this sense of the word. You can call it tav, which is the ancient Hebrew word that is this sort of accordion word. It includes moral excellency. It can include
He's a 10. He likes thinking about killing. Actually killing, he's still a 10. He loves it. After the kill, he looks back on it fondly and enjoys the memory of it. So he's a 10 the whole time away. You stop him, you've taken that 10 and you've reduced it to a 3. Why? What gives you the right to do that? Because you yourself said you can't take away well-being.
Well, I don't know if I have the right to do that, but the right to do it would be to keep the other person's well-being. Because, I mean, even though he's at a 3, he's not at a 0, which what would be the murdered guy would be at after he's murdered.
Sure. Well, let's say that I guess what I'm not getting is this. Here's well-being that we're measuring. You know, here's our psycho. Here's our non-psycho. This is not P versus MP for you mathematicians out there. Yeah, that would have been better, but then I get accused of not knowing how to spell psycho. All right, so our psychopath here, if you stop him from killing, he's at a 3. If you don't stop him from killing, he's got all of this. So you are reducing his well-being. Is what you're doing good?
I'm not reducing his well-being. I'm just keeping his well-being where it's at.
Remember the scenario I said. There are now 3 people. We'll put 3 people in the room. So give me a second on this. 3. There's a psychopath in the room. There's a non-psychopath in the room, and there's you. And you're stronger than both of them. All right. So and we'll put you out here. Your well-being's up here, and you're at a 7. You're just a stoic. So you're a 7 the whole time. Okay. This guy's a 5.
That's the definition of stone.
Yeah, just happy all the time, right? No matter what. That's not really a definition of stoic. So here's a psychopath, and he's sitting over here, and he's planning. He's like, oh, I'm going to kill this guy. And he's 10 happy. And he gets up, and he grabs his knife, and in great anticipation, he's moving towards this other person. You yourself said that you think that you have a moral duty to stop this guy because he's about to violate your rule. The rule is well-being is good unless it takes away the well-being of something else. Now you grab this guy, disarm him, and you tie him up, and you put him on the floor. Now he's a 3 happy. You've taken away his 10, you stopped his 10, and you've made it a 3. Is that by your definition is bad?
But you didn't get to the 10 because you didn't kill him.
He was already at the 10 because, as you know, anticipation of a thing is often better than the thing itself.
Well, then I'll just let him anticipate the whole time and let him be in a 10.
But you stopped him because he was on the way to kill the person.
But I let him be in a 10 because I let him anticipate.
And then you reduced him to a 3. So at the time you reduced him from a 10 to a 3, did you do something morally good or something morally bad?
Did something morally good.
But you reduced his well-being, so by your own rule, you took away well-being that he had. So you'll see that this viewpoint undermines itself if you end up in a scenario like that. Okay, good. Thank you.
That's not to say, though, that well-being isn't good. It's just you're making a dichotomy. It's got to be good or bad. But in the framework that he's talking about, which I would say means that it's not an objective moral or value or duty, but it is a spectrum, right? And there are other aspects to that would come into play.
Well, I don't mean to say that he made this point earlier. He said he doesn't disagree with this. He says, I agree, morally good is perfectly loving. He says, I'm trying to be perfectly loving by preventing this poor person from being killed by a psychopath.
Yeah, sure.
All I'm pointing out is you can't, it is not the case that you need to X this out. You need to X, actually what we X'd out there wasn't the natural selection one. What we X'd out was something like this one. But I'm saying you have to X this view out because it's not identical with this view. If this view is the right view, that's an F. If this view is the right view, then the view of maximizing well-being is what is morally good, is not identical to that. Because here was an action you could take that prevented the loss of well-being, not maximizing, that preventing the loss of well-being was what's going on. Yeah, go ahead.
I think there's a difference between reducing someone's well-being versus eliminating someone's well-being.
Okay. So now are you making a argument for where was our?
Well, just in the case of the murderer killing someone would eliminate that person's well-being rather than reducing the murderer's well-being.
So something is good unless you have to eliminate a person.
If you're being intellectually honest
Right.
with area under the curve, then
But he's not claiming that, if I understood him right. He's saying it's not my job to maximize the area under the curve. Because maximizing the area under the curve would be better done by reducing the people who ain't happy and maximizing the people that are happy.
The more
But
people alive.
he's saying that's not my standard. My standard is well-being. Do that, maximize on the curve, unless you have to take away well-being of somebody else. Now, okay, that didn't work. Let's try something else.
Why would
What
you
about
ever-
eliminating someone else? Sorry.
Why would you have to take away someone's well-being if you're trying to maximize area under the curve? You should always keep as most people alive because they're contributing, even if it's a 0.1, that's still area.
Yeah, but if that area comes at the expense of other area. Because we do live in a planet of limited resources. So back to the alien argument, if in 2020 the aliens are going to show up and we're burning resources that would keep, remember every year of resources we burn is 10,000 years of goodness for them, and they're already 100 times happier than we are. So what we ought to do is be like, oh, the aliens are coming, they're going to be super happy. They're going to ramp up the curve. They're going to have huge area under the curve. We need to kill ourselves completely so that we maximize the area
There's a
under
lot
the
of
curve.
assumptions like that. I mean, it's almost like the Malthus argument that exponential, and we're going to use all the resources. That's kind of a straw man. We don't know that is the case.
Well, let's say that remember this is a very speculative thing, right? This is if we knew that aliens exist that were like this, and we knew that we are burning through resources, that if we did not burn through them, they would be much happier then. Which I do the alien one just because it's kind of, you can obviously exaggerate it. But an easier one to do, and one a little more close to home, is something like this. Look at the World Happiness Survey. When you go out there and look at the World Happiness Survey, you'll find that if people's reporting is consistent, and they're supposed to be controlled for that, people who live in Norway are happy at a 7 level. People who live in Libya are happy at a 3 on average. So if what we're trying to do is turn around and say, okay, let's maximize the area under the curve, let's breed the Norwegians, and let's destroy the Libyans. Because then what happens, if and only if there are limited resources. But remember the Nazi Germany argument was Lebensraum. We just want a little extra living space because we're going to breed the Uberman to go live in much greater joy than these Untermensch that are running around. And so if we can take over the Poles and the Russians and the French and whoever else they want to, and say, don't worry, the Germans are going to be happy in the long run. That was a utilitarian argument that says we're going to maximize in the future the total amount of happiness and good for the planet by getting rid of the parts of the planet that are miserable and drag us down a little bit. Yes, sir.
I'm trying to understand this a little different point. If you're trying to say your equation up there, if this was a game,
Yeah.
you have a starting point and you have a goal, I presume then
one example, an emergency, people work in the emergency medical field. So they show up and they're trying to rescue somebody who's in a bad car accident. Now, just in virtue of doing their job, they end up there's a significant psychological impact on this one, right? It's like you're horrific things that you see all the time, and just watching people die all the time. And not everybody who does that job. Some people who do that job, let's say they're kind of reduced in their well-being from having done so. Now, how frequently do they actually save a life? So as you're running this equation, you're having to show there's a cost to this person being involved. There's a cost to letting people just bleed out and die. There's a cost to not having these people show up and kind of survive on their own and drag themselves to the hospital and everything works out fine. So as you're balancing that equation, is what you're shooting for a maximum final number, like this area under the curve?
I don't understand how that would
Impact it.
Are you trying to say that if
Yeah, that was probably too complicated. Let me ask it more simply. Everybody at your table right there has value. So everybody's got 10 set of value. And if one guy dies, then now instead of having 50, there's 40 left over. Okay, got it. Now, you don't just have this table, you have these other tables out there. And each one of you has a wife, and so you can breed and have kids as well. So over here is a table where their fertility rate is low. They have one baby for every two. That's the max that they can do. Your fertility rate is high. You guys are good at having 10 babies apiece. So there's food. There's enough food that if you guys competed over it, you guys would be able to breed as rapidly as you possibly can, like rabbits. But you're going to do so at the expense of taking away this kind of stuff. By the numerical equation, your moral duty is to go run these people, at least run them off the land. And so they kind of die out on their own. But you've increased the total number of people. So whereas there were 5 people and 5 people, 10 and 10, over the next 50 years, you guys are 100. They would have only been 20. So when you run the numbers, your moral duty now is to run them off their land and breed more rapidly. But if it's a straight equation of each person carries a 10 level value with them, right? Think about it if there's an exception to it. Yes, sir.
Maximal increasing is the argument that I heard. Basically, you want to find the best moral good for this one is that you want to find the maximum.
selection and reproduction. So you can't, if you wouldn't adopt that which benefits the propagation of reproduction and survival, then those are not the same thing as morally good, nor is it the same thing as morally loving. So it's actually not enough to breed so that you have more people. Because it may be that you get more people, but you have less moral goodness. Because let's say those people hit a level that's so bad that their first thought is absolutely violence. And everything that they do turns to violence, and that they're just so morally execrable that the only thing that can be done is to wipe them out completely. I refer you to the books that we're talking about occasionally as to when that has happened historically.
Can I throw out some wild, crazy stuff real quick?
Well, we haven't gotten crazy enough in here yet.
Alright, so what we're talking about with like lions and animals and stuff like that, and then we've talked about AI before.
Yes,
So
yes.
like there are people that would argue that all dogs go to heaven, right? That
Right.
there's sources and heaven dogs in heaven.
Right.
I would say there's not. I would say the difference is morals and ethics, right?
You got some guys that will disagree with you right here, so I may let them.
Call me for a minute, right? Lions, tigers, bears. God didn't endow them with a moral code or an ethical code. The same way you can't code an AI to make ethical decisions. The same way truly autonomous driving is never going to happen because you got to tell that robot, hey, kill the bus full of nuns, or kill the car with 2 kids, right? There's that moral quandary that you can't code, right? And so all that goes back to if objective moral truth is defined by, it can't be, going back to your point from last week, it can't be defined by consensus because consensus changes. It's got to be objective. It can't ever change, and it's got to be good and right, and God is the only one who can endow that.
Yeah, so to some of the points you're making, what I would focus on those last ones and say, at least the project that we're involved in here is to turn around and remember, this is all, we're arguing about the terms of a particular argument. The argument is the following. Basically, it reduces to this. There can be no basis for an objective moral standard if there is no God. So remember, the argument was if God does not exist and objective morals do not exist, objective morals do exist, therefore God exists. And formally, there are other ways of expressing it that maybe make it more clear. But maybe an easier way to say it is this. The only conceivable way to have a truly objective standard is to have it defined. And not defined whimsically, but defined necessarily. And that the necessary definition is that which is good is that which is loving, which is what I'm claiming. So remember remember the Euthyphro dilemma. Do the gods tell us to, this is Plato, Socrates, kind of Socrates asking the question, do the gods tell us to do things because it's morally right to do so, in which case there's some higher standard than the gods? Or is it morally right to do so because the gods tell us to do it? So that's the dilemma is the gods are either at the mercy of good, of that which is good, and they don't get to set it, and so there's some higher standard than them. Or it's the case that it's completely subjective, and if gods want to change their mind, they can change their mind and do whatever else. And the way out of the Euthyphro dilemma is the Christian and Jewish theologians and Muslim theologians' way is saying God, that which is good is that which is like God. That God tells us to do stuff. He tells us to be loving because it is his nature to be loving, and that which is God is that which is good. That the definition of good is the moral character of who God is. So it's not the case. So God could not turn around and say, although I'm loving, I command you to be unloving. That would not be morally consistent.
Two things. Would it be maybe better to have a more, a less restrictive definition to say good is something that God approves of, instead of saying loving?
I mean, you could say that, but the problem is if you're going to say that and you're trying to make the argument to somebody who neither believes in God nor agrees with you that your God is good, then that's not going to get you anywhere with them. Anyway.
So I don't think you need to get into.
Well, hold on. He had a second.
Sorry, go ahead. Because, like I'm thinking about how when Jesus said, "There are none who are good, none but God," but we are to be loving. But if we're loving, and if loving is equal to good, then we are good.
If we are perfectly loving. So now to your spectrum,
okay.
like your life is 1,000 moral decisions long. If you made all 1,000 moral decisions completely lovingly, then you would be completely or perfectly good. Perfect in this term, let's define perfect. Perfect means complete. It means without exception. So if you were good, if you made loving decisions half the time and you made unloving decisions the other half the time, maybe you'd say you're half good, right? Or something like that. So I think I imagine that what Jesus' point there to you, which is a great verse to bring up, is what that is to say, the only one who is perfectly good is God. So when we say good, like good without exception, only God is that. We know that other people do things that even God calls good. So it's not the case that nobody but God can do good, at least biblically speaking, and not philosophically either.
So, wow.
That's what I live for in solid ground. Is for
yeah,
someone that sits in the class and thinks and is like, wow. So by the way,
no,
while he's getting,
I forgot
I
what
know,
I was
but
saying.
rats. Then never mind. My point is.
So I think, well, first of all, I think Jesus was being provocative in that statement to bring up a point of what perfectly morally good is.
Yes.
So it's hard to define what good is by Jesus' statement in that context.
Sure.
And I gotta come back to it. I think, we're talking about the ontology of what good is,
Yes.
and I don't think that's necessary to the argument. You can say that cars exist without getting into the details of, okay, if it's a car, does it have a wheel that's only a certain size? Because when do you become a truck? And all that kind of stuff. And it really doesn't matter because we all agree that cars exist. Likewise, in the moral argument, you need to say, do objective morals and duties exist? Now, sometimes that's hard. You think about the movie Sophie's Choice.
Yeah.
It's not always a dichotomy of was what she did morally absolutely good. And I'm not using the word absolute when I talk about most things because I don't know that they're, except for God, I don't know that we even know what absolutely good, or if there is an absolute good. But there are objective morals, that objectively true values and duties. What's my point? My point is that we can agree that objective morals and values, duties and values exist, and then move forward with the argument without getting into exactly what does that mean, because that is so messy.
How do you
so
move forward with this argument if you agree that objective morals and values exist? Why do you need this argument if you agree that objective moral values exist?
I think there are very few. If you're going to disagree with this argument, right, you've got to say either objectively moral values and duties don't exist, or that if they do exist, which you're going to be hard to find someone who doesn't believe that. There are some, but I would say that their moral sense is just skewed. So anyway, without getting into there, then you've got to say that that does not imply that God exists. And no matter how you define it, if you don't say that they exist in God, they become arbitrary. And very few people will say that that is true.
But you understand the point of this argument.
Yeah, I understand the point of the argument.
It's to do exactly what you just said.
Right.
Okay, so that's why we're making the argument.
But I don't think you'd have to define all of what those objective values and duties are. You see what the point I'm trying to make?
You only have to show that one exists.
You just have to show that they exist. You don't have to even show that one exists. I don't think you have to define what one is. You have to just say, do you
In this
believe
argument, you do. You have to show that at least one moral value or moral truth does exist, because the second premise is an objective moral truths do exist.
Yes.
At least the way this argument is framed, you have to do that. Yes, sir.
All right, so on the first one, right, if God does not exist and objective moral truths do not exist, that's assuming, right? I think we've got, it's one of two things. Either there's a higher power that gives us our moral code, or, I'm arguing for the other side here, it's consensus-based, right? We would all agree that something is bad. I would posit to you, with 8.5 billion people on the planet, it is literally impossible, like not improbable, impossible for 8.5 million people to agree. And I'll just throw out the second that, like the question you posed 3 weeks ago about
Yep.
killing small children and stuff like
Yep.
that. There are people on this planet that doesn't bother. Ergo,
Yep.
there's no there's no possibility or way for humans to form a complete consensus.
Unanimous.
Unanimous, thank you.
Yeah.
Unanimous consensus. Maybe that's redundant. On what is objectively good. Therefore, it has to come from somewhere else.
Unless you're willing to say majority rules, in which case it doesn't have to come from
No,
somewhere.
I'm saying unanimous, not a majority.
Yeah,
We have a benevolent dictator.
but there are a lot, but a lot, like, I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, American
Which is impossible.
society right now appears to be more based on if we, the people, decide this is morally good,
Oh, yeah.
than it is.
Yeah, that's real dangerous.
But that's a consensus, that's a majority-based viewpoint, or at least a
Yeah.
two-thirds majority-based viewpoint or something.
Majority-based also got us the Nazis.
I agree, but my point is, I'm not saying that they're consistent thinkers in America, or that we are consistent thinkers, but rather that that is the way of doing it.
I'm saying definitionally to be
Yeah.
objectively true,
Yes.
right? You have to have unanimity. It would be subjective if you say it's moral or if
No,
you say it's
even
majority
that is not correct. Objective means that even if every person in the entire world agreed that something was morally
That's a good
good,
point. It would still be
yes,
irrespective.
it was unanimously subjectively
Sure.
that way.
Okay.
But it's objective if and only if, even if even the Nazis won and the whole world is nothing but Nazis, and they're like killing people and shoving them in ovens, that's totally fine. That if you would say they're still wrong, that they're actually still wrong for doing so, that's an argument for it. That's a statement of some sort of objective moral truth. Even though unanimously, subjectively, people define shoving babies into ovens as good, it's still factually the case that that's wrong.
Yeah.
The only way to say it's factually the case is that's wrong is to argue there's an objective moral
Well,
standard that says shoving kids and babies
Then
into
you've got to
ovens.
take humans out of it. Then you've got to completely take humans out of defining objective moral good, because we wouldn't be able to get it just because of the.
Well, that's the argument. If God does not exist, then
Like
objective
humans
moral
aren't
truth do not
capable
exist.
of coming up with objective.
Yeah,
moral
but
good.
you're
We're
just
jacked up.
you are, thank you, supporting premise one.
Okay, yeah, that's what I meant to be.
Good, well done, Steve, and then
So, I was just going back to what you said, I was trying to define for my own self, like morality, looking up the history, and it's basically what is right and wrong.
yes,
And it doesn't say necessarily why. But when you said it to kind of like what you ought and what you
ought not.
ought not to do, it kind of implies that there's a reason for why you ought not. And I think that's what we're getting at. But to get it into the practical level, for me to kind of wrap my head around it, it's like, okay, I should not, and I think we all know these things, or we have some semblance of some sort of practical morality, but we don't always stop and think. And it's like, I think if you don't have some additional party or some additional rule, the ought not is just.
Well, that's right. I think you're right. You're not wrong about that. I think that's very similar. That these are the same point. These are two different ways of making the same point.
Maybe I'm kind of jumping ahead or off topic, but kind of going back to the aliens.
Yep.
Would we agree that it's loving to wipe out all humanity so the aliens could thrive?
It's loving to the aliens.
But it's not,
That doesn't seem that loving to the humans, does it?
right, so it's not absolutely good.
Well, remember, you're mixing two standards here. So if the standard is that which is loving, then we not only do we not have a moral duty to kill ourselves and to wipe out those that are unwilling to kind of give well-being to the aliens. Not only do we not have that one, in fact, we have the moral duty not to do that. That's if the standard is being loving. If the standard is maximizing well-being, then that is in direct conflict with the standard to be loving. And that's my point. My point is to say, I have 2 points. One is, this cannot be the standard right here because it's self-defeating.
So,
And it cannot be the case that these are the same.
so it would not be loving.
Well, hold on, let it. Well, yes, but then if you take the aliens out of it and you go back to the room and the psychopaths, same problem.
So it would not be loving to kill everyone.
I agree with that
So,
statement.
so maybe it's kind of like, the reason I bring that up is because, like, why do we call God loving if he flooded the whole earth and killed everyone to bring good in those few people?
If his reason was just to bring good in those few people, then I think we have some reason to question it. But was that his reason? What was his reasoning for doing that? Yeah, that is to say, what is now? This is where I tend to bring up. But this is now starting to get into. I'm not a huge fan of situational ethics because, but we're asking a question that's in there. Often, situational ethics are set up in such a way, and that they tend to not let you do this. They did this to me in junior high, where they were like, "You got 5 people in a boat. One of them's got to get out. You got to throw one of them out. One's a teacher. One's a they try to make you decide." And I'm like, can't somebody, like, the boat's going to sink unless one person gets out, right? Okay, well, can't one person get out, tread for 30 minutes, and you swap out, and they're like, no, you can't do that. I'm like, I'm pretty sure you can. Tell me why you can't. So, like, those kind of situational ethics, I have a real problem. The ones where they're right.
Kind of create a euphoria, or
A dilemma where is
create a bipolar or a dichotomy that maybe doesn't exist.
Yes.
Right.
So back to your state your final question again.
Well, I just brought it up just because we said that God is all loving.
Yes.
So God is all good. So why do we see it as not loving when we kill ourselves and aliens kill us and stuff, but we see it as loving when God does it? So
in the case, let's use as an example the following, and this is a horrible thing to think about, but it's actual. You have 3 kids, and you've brought them all into existence. You've raised them the best that you can, and this happens even the best of households. Some kid, because he's got free will, makes his decision to not be a good kid, and so he's finally gone off his rocker, and he brings into your house a gun, and he's now got the gun pointed at you and the other 2 kids, you and your wife or husband and the other 2 kids. You also have a gun, and he says, "I've had it," and you try your best. You're as eloquent as you can possibly be. You talk him down as best you possibly can. You're outside of a good shoot range, so you can't take him down, and he's responsive enough. So there's no non-lethal version of this one. Let's say that there's a serious danger. He's good with a pistol. You can't charge him. You can't. He's pointed the gun at one of your other children, and you see the tightening of the orbital muscles on his face, and you see the trigger finger taking up the slack. He's pulling the trigger. What do you do?
Did you shoot the gun?
And let's say that yes, that would be a good solution. But most of us are probably not good enough to do that, and so you kind of stuck with the standard that the cops have to use, which is you generally shoot to stop, and that usually means shooting center of mass. So the bottom line is, let's say that you don't think you're good enough to hit the gun. In fact, you're not, and if you miss, he's going to get that one. He's going to get the next one. Now what do you do? And I think at the end of the day, I'm not putting you on the spot, but I think what most people would say is, that would be the worst day of my life. My rest of my life would be hard to live, but would be compelled, out of love, for the people who are not doing the evil, to take down the person who is doing the evil. Now, this doesn't mean that God is now morally bound, because God lets us kill each other all the time, doesn't he? So it can't just be the case that God's interested in keeping people alive and not alive. Okay, if that is the case, then you have great grounds for criticizing God. He's done a terrible job. We are like 2 for 10 billion of people who've made it. Enoch made it out. Elijah made it out. Let's not count Jesus for whatever reason we want to. But that's it. God is like 2 for 10 billion. That guy's the worst, right? That's how. If the goal is keeping people alive, then yes, God's not doing a good job running the show. Is that loving? I mean, what's the goal? God's goal. What is the kingdom of heaven? Eternal life. Eternal life. So if the goal is keeping people alive as long as possible and as happy as possible, then now you're into another argument that we will actually make later. In fact, we're going to make today in this other class. In this world of evil and suffering, how can there be a God in charge of this kind of stuff? So I'll give you the 2-second version, which is this. Let's see if I can do this in 1 minute. It's in my time. 4 possible kids. Kids that are always good, no matter what. Kids that are good only if they're in a pure environment. Kids that are always going to be bad. And kids that are going to be good if and only if they get to see bad stuff or try bad stuff. So just think about 4 kids. You got 4 kids that'll do this. The kid who's always good, no matter what. The kid who's good if he doesn't see bad people. The kid who's good if he sees evil, and he's going to say, "Oh wow, that is bad. I've tried it. I'm going to become good," and the kid who's always bad. So this is the maximum amount of good kids that you can have in your family. 3 of them. This one you can have as soon as you want because he's always good. It doesn't matter. This one you can't have right now if you're going to have these other 2 kids. You're only going to get, if you have just this kid right here and this kid right here, this one will not become good and you're going to lose him. This one has to see evil. So the world, you're going to bring this kid into being with the bad kid so that he can see and experience the evil that happens. And then this one you're going to lose no matter what. There is no scenario where you don't end up shooting a kid. But by doing so, and then once you're done with this kid's out of the way, you can now bring this kid into existence, and you've got 75% of all of the kids that you could possibly have had, and now they're living in a utopian, loving society that's all good. That is the world that we live in. But the reason you're seeing the world right here, and for those who theologically have a problem with this, let me ask you a question. Do babies who die does life begin at conception? Or does life begin at 4 weeks? Most theologians say yes. Where do those babies go when they die? If you die in utero? If they go to heaven, do you know the percentage of children that we lose in humanity that we lose before birth? It's between 25 and 40%, depending on the estimate and how you're using them. Where are those people? Okay, my argument is those might be these people right here. And maybe both of these people, we don't know. But I'm trying to make an argument that not only is God not morally wrong to have a world where evil people are doing evil things. In fact, evil people who do amazingly wicked things, that it's not bad to have those folks in total in the world because they freely chose to do that. God didn't make them do that. And by bringing all 4 of these kids into existence at the right time, you get 75%. Whereas if you didn't do that, the maximum you get is 50%. So that ultimately, this thing, God accomplishes this without himself ever doing any moral evil. And he lets people do the only other thing, we mentioned this, we didn't talk about it. If you don't give people a choice at all, they cannot love you.
Right. That's exactly.
There is no love if there is no choice.
Is that what you were talking about last week with the shotgun wedding?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So you say, love me or else I kill you. That's not really love.
Right.
So, kind of going same again, God saying, love me and choose me or else you'll burn in hell for eternity.
So it is the case that if what you're saying is, if you don't love me, then I will do this. And so only under threat is that considered. What we would say is that's not love. If a person says to God, okay, yeah, I get it. I can either live or you're gonna torture me forever. And so I choose you. I'm merely saying, to me, that's not love. Right? Something done under threat is not love. Now, I think there's a much longer explanation that goes on with all that. But at a minimum, what I would say is, yeah, that's not love. If God's motive in having hell, or if you don't believe in a literal lake of fire torment forever, in having a destruction of the human being, or if you think that when people die, that's it, and they're gone, at least those people are dead. So it's either death, if not torture, it's at least death or love me. If that's his motivation, then that is not loving. I agree. But I don't think that that's his motivation. What I would argue, if I can be his defense lawyer for a second, what I can argue is the motivation is this person is not being happy. This person is actually being miserable. And they're making this person miserable. And they would take this person off the path. So they're materially affecting these folks. So the reason for destruction is, in fact, love of these other 3. And the same reason that the reason for you pulling the trigger and destroying the one child is the love that you bear the other 3. You actually love this one. It kills you to pull the trigger on this one. And I think the same is true of God. God, and the Bible says this, God desires all men to come to him. He doesn't desire the destruction of these people. But he's also not going to let them continue. It's, imagine, again, you got your house. You want to build your perfect house. But one of your kids is just going down the wrong path, and he's a drug addict, and he's a drug dealer, and he's morally bereft in total. Is he going to drag down the rest of the house? Yeah, you love him, but you kick him out of the house. And you kick him out of the house even knowing he may get killed on the streets. You love him, you invite him back all the time, but you don't force him to stay in your house. And heaven, making people who don't love God go to heaven, is forcing people to stay in your house. And that's not loving. So what choice does God have if he's going to give you the choice. That's the way I would put it. All right, we are, if I understand what we did correctly, we almost answered one question today. But I think it was an excellent question, and I think it led us along the way fairly good. We'll tie a bow on this, I think, next time. We'll make some statements that we'll see by a show of hands if anybody wants to actually disagree with, right? Not academically disagree with, well, academically disagree for the purpose of testing, but okay, fine, let's get it down. Are there people who actually don't, would believe or won't believe, that kind of stuff? And then we'll see if this argument goes through. And then we'll move on to the next one, if so. Now, I would, you brought this point up, let me just highlight this. If God does not exist, then objective moral truths do not exist. There's a relationship contained in there that you're not arguing for here. That is the reason that I think, as you rightly question the form of the argument, you got to remember that it's baked into this assumption.
My objection to that is the logic is solid, but it's just the premise that the only explanation for objective moral truths could be a God.
That's what this does reduce to. So if you disagree with that, then you would not agree with the first premise. But not only, I would say this, not you have to give me another example, but you have to give me at least, if I'm going to claim that it's necessarily the case that if no God, then no objective moral truth, you have to at least give the concept of how an objective moral truth would exist absent God. If you can do that, then the first premise falls, and then the argument fails. But you have to at least give, like, okay, how could I even conceive of an objective good that isn't based in God? Then this argument, no good. All right, well done. Thank you. This is exactly what I was hoping. For those that haven't been to Solid Ground before and you're wondering, is this a Bible study class? This is a class where everybody, no matter you're religious, a-religious, particular brand of Christianity, can come in here and discuss baseline truths that we are making an argument that Christianity best instantiates the right solution to these. But that's what this is. This is a discussion format we do this. I should probably we have a couple of missionaries with us. Do you mind? I know we're a little bit over time, and so I apologize. Can you give us 60 seconds on what you do so that the folks know?
We simply try to work in countries that if you say God, they say who.
Okay.
And if they
I ain't looking for nothing, but I just seen her with time.